Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. Today I'd like to show you how to hand cut a dovetail that I'm calling a signature dovetail. Now, other people might have a different name for it, but that's what I dubbed it. What it is, it's a dovetail that's a little bit more artistic. It's intended to be something that you might hide on the bottom drawer like I did down here, and maybe it's based off your logo, in which case it is kind of a signature, or maybe it's just based off of a design that fits in with the rest of your item. Now this one here, it doesn't have anything necessarily to do with sculpting. I did have a couple designs I thought of trying for the sculpting, but I ended up just deciding on something that might be, somewhat Greene and Greene looking. So it's set to be like a stagger step of basically like a Greene and Greene cloud lift, and then it has the simulated spline made out of the mahogany, and then it has two pins on the end that look like ebony plugs. So whether it's just sort of gimmicky or something like that, I don't know, but there are a lot of different design ideas that you could come up with instead for a signature dovetail, something again that might tie in with the design of the project that you're doing, in which case I would have had to sculpt mine, or maybe something based off your logo, in which case since mine's 1/2 inch shy, well, I would have to cut it 1/2 inch shy and just butt glue the joints together. Now in this video series, the first two videos tried to emphasize how for making basic dovetails, you can use pins first, tails first, doesn't really matter. Pick the one that you're the most comfortable with. They both have their advantages, they both have their advantages over the other one, so they kind of cancel out. But what I want to try showing in these two videos is, like this dovetail here is very much easier to cut if you're cutting it tails first versus pins first. Pins first, it would actually be very difficult to do. Whereas there's another video in this series doing houndstooth dovetails, where there, pins first is definitely the easiest way to go if you're just doing it by eye without a lot of layout. And tails first would just be very, very difficult. So these two videos try to show how both techniques can be used in the right place. So, whether you like the Greene and Greene style dovetail or not, I don't know, but let's just go ahead and take a look and see how we can make it so that you can adapt it for your own work. So I've already cut the tails on the outside edges here. So we're doing a tails first design. And then I've made some marks here. Now, normally I don't do very much layout because I'm trying to do this stuff by eye, but I really wanted to get this sort of signature done correctly in the middle. So I centered it, and then I used the centering rule to mark off the distance from the middle. So I was going 8 millimeters, 14 and 20 millimeters from either side of this center point to line up some lines. Now, what is this signature dovetail going to look like? Now that you get to go and get back to my drawing abilities. So I'll apologize in advance. So if this was our board, and this is the way that the tail is going to look like, so the rest of the board is down here. I guess I can draw a little bit of grain down here. That's the rest of our board. What I'd like to do with these dovetails is it's going to start with a bit of a curve on the bottom like that, and then there'll be another looping curve. And then there'll be yet another looping curve that finishes it out touching the top. So you can see where that's classic from Greene and Greene. This is looking a little like a cloud lift. In this case here, it's going to be still shaped a little like a dovetail. It wouldn't have to be because there's plenty of extra strength up here that we could do something different. In fact, I went through a number of different ideas of what they could even look like. I mean, here you could almost do something that looks like a bridge. This has recesses that are cut out of the middle, so cutouts are a little bit more complicated. This one here, I was going to do something, it almost looks like a pi symbol, but there was going to be a mirror image next to it. These are the Greene and Greene dovetails that I was discussing here. This is very much what the design is that I'm looking at. You could do triangles. This one here was going to look like a knot. These, even though there's curves in all these, it's still going to be fairly simple to do, and you'll see how I do the transfer of this signature from here, doing tails first, to the pin board and cut that out. And I'll discuss a little bit of doing negative space, where you're cutting out something from the middle, in a way like doing an inlay. In fact, we're going to do a small one, very, very small, and it's actually going to be plugged after the fact, so it's a little different than, say, one of these here, or inside this bridge. But what we're going to do is, to sort of simulate the idea of the ebony splines, we're going to cut just a thin kerf right where this green line is, and here. So again, looking very Greene and Greene, and you're going to see, in the case of the front board, the pin board being the mahogany, you're going to see the mahogany poke up through those holes. Now, I'm not going to cut a thin slice of mahogany here that's going to get pushed up through. That would be next to impossible, pushing it through. So what we're going to do is we're simply going to cut the kerf using the fret saw. Then after the thing is assembled, when we go to glue it, we're going to take a thin sliver or even just a plain shaving of this mahogany, and we're going to push it down into that hole when it glues up. Then afterwards, when we plane it, you'll see a fine mahogany line there with end grain showing, so it'll match the rest of it. And it should look pretty interesting, I'm thinking. Now, if you wanted to simulate sort of the ebony plugs, one thing I had thought of, and it depends on how this is going to look, is I was considering on these ends of the mahogany, the mahogany splines that are emulating the ebony splines, is you could take a very small, thin brass tack. You know, they have the ones that are basically small brass nails, and you could pre-drill a hole in all 4 of these places and basically tack it straight down. So you're going to have, in a sense, a brass tack there. And I'm thinking I'm going to do that. I'm going to take a look and see what it looks like at the end, and we can decide later. But I think this is going to look really interesting right here in the middle. So only when you open the bottom drawer are you going to see this. I mean, it's still very structurally sound because, you know, that's a huge dovetail. But also, in fact, it's going to be pinned too if you have those brass tacks. So at this point in the cutting, I've already cut the tails for the outside ones. These are just going to be plain tails. This is just like you saw in the first videos. But now I need to fret saw it out. Now I need to fret saw some of this stock out in order to make this design. So since you can see that the outer edges, these outer marks, are going to more or less define where this design is going to happen, what I'm going to do is just going to take a square and mark out some lines beyond that. So if I cut up to there and I clean out that waist, then I'm going to be left with a block here that I can do the fret saw work for doing this without having all this other material around it. It'll kind of, I don't know, seems like it would make it a little easier. So let's go to that. Completely admit, fret sawing this direction, I'm really bad at it. Now for here, I'm just going to cut with this straight down where I placed those lines, which I didn't transfer to the back, but that's okay, we'll get close. Now for doing this layout, you can see that if this is the outside edge of the board, similar to the layout the way I've got it here, I'm kind of cutting this into thirds. So what I did is I set up this marking gauge to be basically thirds of the thickness of the mahogany. And what I'm going to do is just scribe along here. So off center, I had done marks at the 8, 14, and 20, and that's intended for these 3 strata. There are distances, so there's this one's the 8, 14, and then 20 off of there. So I'm just making marks to extend those marks out so I have an idea where I'm going up to. So I'll go ahead and take the saw and I can make a straight cut down and then just go across with the fret saw to go to here, down, and just work my way down to make this staircase. And then this part here will get cleared across with the fret saw and then later cleaned with the chisels. Now we have some very interesting chiseling to do. And this is what I came up with the cleaning. Thankfully, I have a 16th inch chisel. those are some little tiny areas to go and dig into. But for the most part, I'm happy with the way it looks. It's still rectangular though. Everything has been left rectangular. You could even leave it this way. I don't see a reason why you couldn't. In fact, the more I look at it, the more I think that actually doesn't look too bad. So, but I did clean down. One thing that's interesting to note, this is the inside of the drawer. I was working always from the outside because the outside is the one that really matters to make it look good. So this one here, I made sure that these lines are where I want them. The back here, we could actually even back cut all of this. You know, in a way, I could take a chisel and just go down at an angle, taking off large chunks of this back part. As long as I leave this here flat, you know, because that's going to be, well, actually in this case here, no, because there's an applied drawer front, so you won't see it. But normally you would care to leave that. But this inside part is going to be totally buried inside the mahogany. So it's not going to matter if I back cut some of this to make sure that it goes in a little easier. So I left it square. It's a little bit rougher on the back here, but it's been left square. I'm going to transpose this onto the mahogany, and then afterwards I can do some shaping on here. Okay, so a small change of plan. After I was cleaning it up a little bit more, I think I do like this sort of rectilinear shape versus, you know, we have some straight angles here. This is at an angle, but it's still straight lines that form it all, whereas the rest of the mahogany is all sculpted. So I think I'm going to keep it like this, and we'll see how it looks. So being able to pull this out all the way and reach down in there is very handy. So there we go. So of course, when I'm doing this type of a joint, I'm going to be removing, going back to my little green marker here, I'll be removing this tail socket, and of course that one's pretty obvious. And then there's going to be all this to remove. Now, I have these lines, I have to stay within the lines. So the lines are kind of fat because of the way that I was trying to reach in there and such. And the thing that's an advantage is that, again, we can back cut this piece on the other side to make it a little easier to insert so that everything can get in the whole way. But what's nice is that mahogany is compressible, so we could actually make this a little bit on the snug side. And if it's back cut on here, when we go to insert it up, when it just gets to the front, everything will just tighten right up. And it should make it a nice clean joint. In fact, it might even make the edges look a little rounded anyway because of the way that they're being forced in there. So let me go ahead and start cutting these, and then I'll start getting onto some shaping. I'm not going to show you the boring details of all the carving stuff until we get to something interesting. Okay, I just hammered together the test fit. I was being very careful. At first, because some of these lines here were a little on the fat side because of the way I had to mark them from such a distance and all that, and they were hard to get in there. What I did is I left them a little on the overly tight side. So as I was hitting this in, you could see it denting. So I'd pull it back in, chisel away, push it back in, do it a few times. I have to say this is almost the best one that I've done out of all the drawers so far, and this was the experiment. But I'm really liking this joint. I'll do one on the other side. I won't say it's the fastest thing to chisel away. Now that I've done it the first time though, I'm sure the second one will go a lot faster. So I think this is going to look really sharp on the side of a drawer. So our next step in these signature dovetails is to basically add our spline to this kind of cloud lifty green and green type accent that I've put here in the middle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be drilling a set of holes. I'm going to be fret sawing a slice right through this dovetail. When this is assembled for glue up, I'm going to be taking a wedge of the mahogany and putting it into that kerf. It might just be a really thick shaving, or we might be able to get a wedge. We'll see what it looks like after the kerf is cut. And then when this all gets planed, you're going to basically see the mahogany line coming through. So it's going to look a little like a spline, using that whole idea of the green and green. And then I'm going to pin the ends. Now, initially I mentioned that I was going to use, say, some brass pins, but then I fell upon some panel nails. And this panel nail assortment actually comes with some black epoxy headed nails. So I mean, I'm not going to use these big long ones. There are some shorter ones in here, but just so you can see, the heads on these are, you know, epoxy black. So this is going to be really neat to put on the ends of that single spline that I'm putting in there. Now, I also initially thought of putting 2 splines, but with the size of these heads, the size of everything else, it would just be way too much. So just that one spline going across it with the 2 pins at the end here are really going to make it look pretty good. And also these nails, because again, this dovetail is a little weak. These upper sections here are really prone to cracking off. In fact, both boards have one of these that came a little bit loose, so I added a little bit of glue to help keep that solid. So these 2 outside portions here, really not adding to the strength. The main body of it, though, kind of is. It's still not the strongest dovetail in the world, but by having the pins going through it, it's going to increase its strength. Now, I mean, we're doing this more for a decorative look, but at the same time, you know, we want something supporting this drawer in the middle, so that's what we're going to get with the pin. So I'm going to drill 2 16th-inch holes on here for the fret saw to be able to enter, and actually that's going to be a good lead hole for the nail to go in when we go to put it in. Now we're just going to thread the fret saw through. And there we go. So now I'm going to assemble the drawer with these dovetails in place, and then after we do the glue up, I'm going to be pushing what looks like just a thick plain shaving, jam that down in there, and then when everything is dried and that gets planed off, we're going to see a nice mahogany line. So this drawer is dried overnight. I haven't done any cleaning at all. These pins are still proud, and you know, there's still some of the squeeze out. But what I want to do before that is I want to put some of the mahogany, so this is just a scrap out of my bin, that I'm going to put a strip of the mahogany inside this sliver. When it's inside the kerf, it's going to be sticking up proud. Then once it's dried, then we can go ahead and cut it off with a flush trim saw, and then I'll be planing all these sides to clean up the drawers like you normally would. There we go. So we got a little bit of a wedge. This is all end grain that's sticking up here on the top. That's what's going to be visible, but you can see I just cut it as a wedge. Doesn't really matter that it's not all that pretty. What I'm going to do is now cut this to size. So let me square off this end a little bit with a chisel. I'm actually going to make it kind of back cut a little tiny bit. So that's going to be for this side. Now again, these holes here are going to be where I'm going to be put the black nails. But I'm going to be re-drilling those. So I don't care if this is a little bit into that hole, because I'll be re-drilling it all the way down into this board here to make sure that I have a piloted hole. I don't want that nail splitting this at all or causing any bulges. It's just going to, it's a tight fit as it is with a 16th inch drill bit. So we'll put this here. Just like that. Going to apply a little bit of glue to that, push it in. I am going to put a clamp across here to make sure that when I'm pushing in this wedge, it doesn't cause any problems here. I mean, I'm not going to pound it in, but at the same time, I don't want to take a chance. Not going to want to really tap that in, just going to give it a push with my fingers. That's it. Just going to leave it like that for a little while, and then I'm going to do the other side in the meantime. So you can see our little dovetail with basically the imitation spline made out of mahogany. Comes out pretty nice after you've done some cleaning with it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to re-drill these holes so that now I can drive in one of these panel nails. There's a black epoxy panel nail in here, so at least I don't have to worry about the finish coming off or anything like that. We'll just tap it in with a plastic mallet so we don't chip it. Let's take a look and see what this looks like. Now these are actually going to be a snug fit, so I'm just going to go ahead and there you go. A little different. That's all I wanted, just something a little bit different. But as a signature dovetail, you could always, like we talked about, you could make this a different design. Maybe something that's abstracted out from your logo. Or maybe something if you're doing a particular type of piece. I mean, obviously a Greene and Greene piece, you could use something like this if that's what you really wanted to do. But if there's a piece that has a certain type of character, you might be able to pick out a dovetail that follows the character, just for some fun. That way there, it kind of signs your work at the same time as looking like a little bit of an Easter egg hidden away.